Welcome to the podcast, Science of High Paid, High Performing, Happy Engineers, the show to help engineers develop all skills non technical. My name is Aditya Gute, and I'm a speaker and a performance coach for engineers to transform them into rock stars.
All right. Hey guys, welcome to the show. We have April Wensel. April Wensel is an international keynote speaker and the founder of Compassionate Coding, a conscious business focused on training technologists in emotional intelligence and social responsibility. She spent the previous decade as a software engineer and technical leader at various firms in Silicon Valley, building products in such fields as healthcare, education, and user research. Through speaking and training, she's a tremendous speaker, by the way. You have to check out her videos on YouTube. She now plants seeds of compassion in tech communities around the world. Away from the keyboard and the stage, she enjoys gleaning fruit, running ultra marathons, and baking tasty vegan retreats. That's so cool. I'm mostly vegan, not 100%. So you should give me some vegan recipes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Just be careful what you ask for. Once you let me give you recipes, you'll never hear the end of it.
Oh, I love that. Great. So April, tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what made you go from engineer to now helping communities, engineers, and corporations with compassion and emotional intelligence?
It's funny because it's actually related to that last bit about going vegan. So my background as a software engineer was fairly typical. I studied computer science in high school. I studied it in college, worked in tech for, as you mentioned, about a decade at different companies. And around the time that I'd been in tech for about a decade, I was starting to feel kind of burnt out and kind of disillusioned with some of the problems in the industry, which are coming to light a bit more now in terms of the products that we're building and whether or not they're helping society. And even just the makeup of the people in tech, like a lack of diversity among the different engineers. And so along with that, so the personal kind of burnout, addition to disillusionment, at the same time, I went vegan. And so through going vegan, I learned about compassion, which is, this idea. It was a very rational concept in the way it was presented to me, which appealed to my engineer brain, which is that compassion is really just about understanding the pain and suffering in the world and wanting to alleviate it, which to me seemed very consistent with engineering because we're trying to solve problems and those problems are causing people suffering. And so it seemed very consistent with that. So I was like, I think that what's missing from tech is like a very firm understanding of compassion and what it can do for our own well-being and for the well-being of our users and society in general. And so that's when I started my company to spread this idea of this rational compassion that I had learned about to help people become better engineers and just to become happier, more, fulfilled people.
Yeah, totally. So this compassion, why should an engineer be compassionate?
Yeah, so it seems counterintuitive. I think when I first started my company, Compassionate Coding, people would say, isn't that an oxymoron, compassion and coding? Because it seems contradictory. But one point is, as I mentioned, engineering really is about solving problems and alleviating suffering at its core. It really is about that. So it's consistent in that way. So if you want to help your customers, it's good to understand where their pain points are and where they're hurting. Secondly, although we're working with machines as engineers, we're also collaborating with other human beings. So being able to communicate your ideas, being able to have empathy for different perspectives and understand that helps you collaborate better with your team. And so that makes you more effective. And then finally, I touched on how I sort of went through a period of burnout. Compassion helps prevent that, both because you practice compassion for yourself and start to notice when you're suffering, and try to take steps to alleviate that or take steps to improve your situation. But also it sort of creates this connectedness and recognition that we're all connected, which, the pandemic has certainly brought to light how connected we are in terms of, something that happens on one side of the world affects people on the other side of the world. And so compassion kind of links you to the human community. And so it can help in that regard too, in terms of supporting your well-being. So those are a few reasons that I think engineers can benefit from caring about compassion.
Like you said, engineers, most of us communicate with the machines, right? We write software when most of engineers are not people person. So tell me your experience in working with engineers, helping them build compassion.
Yeah, so I would even challenge the idea that engineers aren't people, that they're not, caring about people, because I think that, being emotionally intelligent, you don't have to be an extrovert. You know what I mean? So introverts, a lot of engineers are introverts, and not all of them though. But so, understanding other people's emotions and whatnot is something that anyone can learn. And so even engineers. So I think that there's a stereotype that engineers don't really do well with people. But again, I think it's more of a stereotype because especially as more people enter the field, we're starting to see quite a variety of personalities attracted to engineering. So I think that it's definitely something that is accessible to anyone who, starting wherever they are, can start to improve these skills.
And how can they improve compassion?
Yes. So it starts with something that engineers have trouble doing, which this I will admit, which is slowing down. So, a lot of times we hear mindfulness as sort of a buzzword, but at its heart, it's really just about slowing down and paying attention to what's going on. The idea is not that you slow down and then stay slow. The idea is that you slow down, recognize what's going on, decide how to go about it in a very conscious, intentional way. And so how this comes into emotional intelligence is it takes slowing down to a more human, not machine pace in order to notice how the people around you are feeling, notice how you're feeling, notice if a lot of times as you start to edge on the border of burnout, you can feel it in your body. Your body feels exhausted, but you can only notice that if you tune into it. So, stopping and taking a few breaths, I think is it sounds simple, but I think if more engineers did this on a regular basis, it could be life-changing. So I think that's the first step, is just slowing down in order to recognize. And then the other side is just while you're in that place of being more mindful, being more present in the moment, paying attention to the people around you. So you can even practice this out in the world when you're waiting in line at the grocery store. Just take a moment when you're, already having to wait in line. Think about the people in that line with you. Think about what their lives might be like, It's also helpful when you're feeling frustrated. So if you're like, gosh, this person's so slow and they're taking forever and you get frustrated, think, I wonder, if they're, struggling with something at home and maybe that's why they're distracted and that's why whatever it may be. And so using your imagination to try to think about, what kind of things are other people dealing with, or your coworkers, if they're slow to deliver something, or if they seem in kind of a snappy mood, try to at least imagine what might be happening in their life that's causing that. And you may not know, but even just taking a moment and imagining can help open your heart, open your mind, and feel a little bit more compassion.
One of the things I notice is, being frustrated or becoming angry quickly is one of the very common things that you see in software engineering teams whenever there is a misunderstanding or something, right? So during those moments, I think what you're alluding to is slow down before reacting, slow down and see where the other person is coming from, slow down and see what your intention is, what you are trying to communicate, right? And there is a pause, and you can maximize that pause to create some awareness. And is that what you're referring to, April?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it ties into, Daniel Kahneman has this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about two systems of that are at work in our brain. And one is the fast system, system one, and that's our reactive, like fight or flight kind of mode. And then we have system two, where we're more contemplative and more intentional and rational, but it takes slowing down to get to that point. And so absolutely, I think one of the exercises we do in a lot of my workshops is thinking about a time, when you lost your temper or you lost control of your emotions, and thinking about what was going on, what sort of, triggered you in that way, and how you might approach it differently in the future. And so, yeah, it is about sort of practicing recognizing what those emotions are. And it's an interesting point, because one thing about engineers is a lot of times we want to act like we're completely rational. So we're not angry, we're just, the other person's wrong, and we're just very rationally communicating why they're wrong. But then when we start like elevating our voice and start, maybe our heart's beating fast and things, we're not completely rational. We're operating in that fast emotional brain. And so it's just about slowing down and admitting that rarely are we completely rational. Our emotions are running all the time, So I think that's it. You said it well. It's an important practice to do.
Yeah, and adding to what you said, even Stephen Covey, he talks about there is a space between stimulus and reaction, and the more you can maximize that space between stimulus and reaction, you can have some immense breakthroughs. So following up on that question, April, one of the challenges I do face, right, when I'm handling engineers, some engineers, not all of them, of course, we can't generalize. They tend to play down the feelings, the importance of going deeper into their feelings. Sometimes, as a coach, I've asked them questions if they want to dig deeper into a certain situation. They're like, no, I don't want to talk about my feelings. So what's your response like to those engineers who completely avoid feelings, have judgment about talking about it?
Yeah, that's a good point. I have been doing workshops, and we're doing an exercise of just even talking about how we're feeling right now. And they're looking through this list of emotions, because I give them this list, and they're like, one raised their hand and they're like, what if we feel nothing? And it was just interesting because, they're just, and it's like, if you've never thought about this before, it seems, yeah, like, why should we even talk about this stuff? So there's several different approaches. So one is with engineers, a lot of times presenting the data that supports the idea that being present and understanding of your emotions makes you more effective at your job. So there have been a lot of studies on this in the past few years, the past few decades, really, about the benefits of emotional intelligence and that sort of thing. So one is to present the data, that sort of thing. The other thing is kind of making an appeal to the emotions, even if they don't recognize that they have them, which is just to say, like, why don't we just practice doing this? Like, why don't we just give it, like, suspend your judgment for a moment and let's try it and see if it helps you, right? And so getting them to do an experiment themselves is another way to do it. Because here's the thing is, if somebody does an exercise and they end up feeling better, then, then you've made the case, right? So if you can, it's kind of like how we do prototyping of products in engineering, where you try a little bit, see if it works. So if you can get engineers to prototype, caring about their emotions, and they see the benefits, then, they're more likely to want to do this. And then the other thing I would say, though, with all of that, is that you can't, and you wouldn't want to force people into this. So, and I know you don't either, but it's something that I think some people are not, it's a sort of subtlety. It's like, I talk about compassion, but I would never try to force compassion on people, like say, you must be compassionate, because then I'm not being compassionate, right? So in a similar way, it's like, nobody wants these sorts of skills forced on them. It has to really be a conscious choice. And so you can present the data, you can, show people how this can help them. But at the end of the day, we all have the power, personal power, to make the choice of whether or not we want to pursue these things. And so I do respect that too. And I'm sure you do too. Like some people, they'll have to come to it in their own time. And that does happen, where I'll hear from someone like years later and they're like, oh, I finally get this. I finally see why this is so important. And so I think part of doing this work is making peace with that I don't have control over other people's behavior. I only have control over my behavior. And then, I do my best. I plant seeds of compassion, as I put it. And that's really all we can do.
I like forcing feelings. I tell people, let's talk about your feelings, bro.
Yeah, you support that. I'm sure that works really well.
Yeah, for sure. But I think I like a couple of things, which is that you use the engineering language, right? Now sometimes you got to do a prototype, like let's prototype this thing and see if it works. If it doesn't work, we don't have to do this, right?
Yes.
And like you said, everyone is on their own journey. So whenever they're ready, they'll talk about it. And we all experience those moments where 5 years ago, this person said this, now it makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So totally agree with you on that point too. You also spoke about, April, 10 years, after 10 years, you experienced a kind of burnout, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the point where most engineers experience burnout after 5 to, it kind of starts at 5, it becomes like really serious at 10. So why is that? What do you think that happens?
Well, so many things, but I think one thing is just the way the culture is set up. There's a never-ending stream of things that you could be working on, right? So because we're used to working on machines work very quickly. And so we can almost treat ourselves like machines. Like we should be able to crank out stuff really quickly. We kind of live from, like the neck up in terms of a lot of times, like we're not going for a walk. We're not taking time for ourselves we're not even getting good sleep. And this, companies encourage this because in the short term, it helps them in the short term because, human beings are very resilient creatures, right? So we have the ability to be stressed out for a certain period of time and we can be functional because, a lot of times like the chemicals that are running through our body make us feel like we feel adrenaline. We feel like, if you stay up all night during crunch time and you feel really energized and powerful. The problem is that eventually that accumulates and then you get to a point where you either burn out or you at least notice the signs of burnout that you're getting close. And so I think it's the culture of this, like trying to prove yourself, trying to compete all the time, and companies incentivizing that by like, if you end up staying till 3 a.m, they're like, oh, like April's like, such a hero on this team. She's staying till 3 a.m. And so then I'm like, oh, I want to be a hero. And then everyone else is like, oh, we want to be heroes too. And so then you end up creating this culture of like glamorizing the people who burn themselves out. And I think that that's a big piece of it. And then it's just a lack of awareness too. These skills, emotional intelligence, as we've been talking about, because they're not valued by engineers and they're not taught very frequently to engineers, we're not able to sort of self-identify the problem or self-diagnose to some extent, not official diagnosis, but you know what I mean, to look at the problem. And that contributes to it too. So it's both a personal issue and a sort of larger cultural issue.
I'm super glad you said those points because one of the things is that it's a system that gets created, right, in these corporations, like you said. Those people who are like working hard, they're doing like 3 a.m. in the morning every day. These are the people who are being rewarded. They get promotions. They get applauded for their hard work. So everyone want to be that person, mm-hmm. and it becomes that culture, and over time you can burn out really quick.
Yep, absolutely.
You also spoke about lack of diversity in these engineering teams. Would you like to speak a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, just from my perspective, I'll share that. So, as a woman engineer, I noticed that there weren't a lot of other women engineers, and then as I started to become more conscious of that, and the lack of diversity along other lines, the lack of people of color on a lot of teams, the lack of LGBTQ plus like community on teams, or whatever it may be, an underrepresentation of certain groups. And then you start to see some of the cultural issues, and you start to like see the connection between some of the unhealthy culture phenomenon, and then how that relates to not creating a welcoming environment for people with different perspectives and different backgrounds. And so for example, when we have stereotypes ruling the day in terms of what a good engineer looks like or does, then what we can do is we use that stereotype as a filter, and it ends up creating this very unwelcoming environment for people who fall outside of that stereotype in whatever way. But I'm not an expert on this side of things, but that's just one thing that I noticed, from my perspective in the industry.
Yeah. So, what do you think about Indian engineers?
Again, talk about not being an expert. I feel like I don't think that there's any way for me to stay in my lane and answer that question.
The reason why I ask is I know that's an uncomfortable question, but when people see me, right, in America, they ask me if I'm an engineer, because if you're an Indian, they assume, and you're in America, they assume you're an engineer. So I'm always curious how the perspective of an Indian engineer is from an outsider perspective.
That's an interesting question. So I try not to make like generalizations about groups of people. And so, I don't have like a specific answer to that question, but I think that you pointing that out does point out a problem with this stereotyping, right? Because it does happen to be that you're an engineer, right? But I'm sure that, I don't know. I know that when people make assumptions about me, like just based on what I look like or what they think about me, I don't really like the way that feels. So I don't know. Like, what do you think about it?
I totally agree. I mean, it feels kind of very uncomfortable. I probably have to understand what that exact feeling is, because I could be doing a lot more things. And also, I think that puts people in a certain mode that the only thing I can do is an engineer. Mm-hmm. Probably I'm not good enough for anything else, because that's how everyone sees me, as this engineer who puts his head down and writes code, right? So it also limits my possibilities of what I can do with my life. And I'm sure it's not just Indian engineers who experience this. Different people experience this in different ways. So I totally agree with you on that.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I mean, I think it's anytime we're putting people in boxes based on, especially on characteristics that are outside their control, and we're making assumptions. I know one thing that a lot of women engineers experience is being like, they'll be at a technical conference and people will assume that they're a recruiter or they're in marketing. And anytime I give this example, I like to say there's nothing wrong with those roles. Those are great roles too. But it's interesting that people assume that the women couldn't be engineers, that they must be other roles. And again, it's not that one's better than the other, just like an engineer versus other roles that you could have. It doesn't mean, it's not that one's better than the other. It's just, let's not take these shortcuts. And I think that ties back to the whole fast and slow thinking. Like, that's our stereotyped fast brain thing, putting people in boxes. And I think that if we can stop doing that, I think that we can have more compassion and more understanding for people's, full variety of people's, choices and their own authentic self. And I think that that's the goal. I see it as.
Yeah, totally. I love that. So, and one of the questions I commonly get asked, April, is an engineer who gets promoted as manager, right? This engineer is a high achiever. He gets things done. He's known for meeting targets or exceeding his goals. And now he's given his team. So not only he's motivated, he can get things done, but now he has to motivate his team to meet the deadline and overachieve his goals, because his promotion is dependent on how well his team does and not solely based on him, right? So in this scenario, what's your advice? What kind of advice would you give to this engineering manager on how he can rally his team to accomplish the goals?
Well, I think anytime you're talking about management, I mean, I think that the manager's goal is to empower their team. So to empower the people to pursue their own goals for their own reasons. And so we may have like commonality on the team in terms of, shared company values and things like that. But I think to really unlock people's power, people's personal power to achieve, it's the manager's role to look at their team and to speak with them and feel, practice empathy to understand what's motivating each of those engineers. And then when you can touch on that, then that can help set goals together so that the engineers feel like they are playing a role, an active role in their own path, in their own journey, rather than sort of caving to the demands of an overbearing manager. So I think it's about understanding people's core values. That's another thing that I often do in workshops is uncover people's core values. So we do exercises on trying to tease those out so that you know what motivates you personally, and then you can use that to reach whatever other goals you're doing. But it's important to understand what really matters to you on a deep level. And then you can have those conversations with your manager. And so if the manager motivates people to understand their core values, then it's easier to have that conversation and work together on that.
Yeah, great. And last follow-up question on what you just said, April. So at what point do the manager needs to start writing code because one of his team member is getting behind? So now he gets into the nitty-gritties of the coding process.
So that's an interesting question. I mean, I think that a lot of times it's great when managers are still able to code, like when they do still retain that ability, because some managers don't, and that's fine too. They can specialize more on motivating people, but it's nice when they do retain that ability, because then they can pitch in and contribute in that way. But, I think the mark of a really strong manager too is being able to motivate your team to accomplish these goals. And as far as kind of chipping in and doing it, I could see, and I've done that, right, like in certain situations, but that might be an indication of something broken in the process, that we needed this sort of like extra thing to happen. And so the reason I mentioned this is it can lead to that thing we were talking about with relation to burnout. Like if the engineering manager is setting the example of, oh yeah, like I'll stay late and I'll do this coding and I'll go, work overtime to do this and all that sort of thing, then it could lead the other engineers on the team to think, oh, we should do that too. And we should, so I think that there's a balance between helping reach these goals, but also balancing taking care of yourself and not burning out by trying to overcompensate for something that's broken in the process.
I love how you mentioned that something is broken in the process, because by just trying to write the code and stepping into the developer's shoes, it might be a short-term fix, but it's not a long-term fix. The manager can be doing that every weekend, every single day that happens. But that's an opportunity for the manager or the leadership team to look into what's something broken at a deeper level, right? And maybe compassion and emotional intelligence that you talk about play a great role in how this can be resolved. Any final thoughts, April, before we close this session?
I think we've touched on most things, but I think one thing I would just say to any engineers wanting to grow emotional intelligence and specifically compassion is don't be afraid to get started just because you may be putting yourself in a box of I'm not a people person or whatever it may be. These skills are accessible to anyone who wants to practice them, and they do have a lot of benefits. And I think that they can help you throughout your lifetime. And, becoming a compassionate human being is a lifelong project, right? And so it's not something that you do one workshop and then you're compassionate. It's something that we all grow for our whole lives. And similarly, engineering, it's like we keep learning, and it's a similar thing to emotional intelligence. So I would say start small and and be kind with yourself through the process.
Great message, April. Thank you so much again for being with us here and sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
Yeah, thank you.